Hello, I'm Brad.
And I'm Jason.
You are listening to Dice and Mind, a monthly podcast in which we explore the meaning of life through the lens of RPGs.
We're lifelong friends, a couple of guys in their 40s who along the way had families and became professionals. Over the years, we've talked about pretty much everything. But recently, we realized we both had an interest and some history with tabletop role-playing games. So,
In each episode, we will consider everyday stuff like science, religion, philosophy, and economics, all through the lens of a specific role playing game and its dice mechanic. For example, what would I have to roll in the Edge of the Empire narrative dice system to get that promotion at work?
or would getting that paper published give me advantage on a subsequent D20 roll in Dungeons and Dragons?
If I were DM, likely not. But join us now and every month to think deeply, geek out, and explore how RPGs make the world just a little bit better.
This is
Dice in Mind.
Welcome back, folks. For many of you listening to this, you might be binging. This might be a matter of days since you first heard our initial episode, but for us, it's been a few weeks since we've been able to get together and record and talk about ethics, faith, philosophy, economics when it comes to role playing, whether it's games, board games, RPGs, or whatnot. So we're just getting back into the swing of things. Tonight, we're going to talk about a game much like I pulled Jason into playing D&D with me. Jason pulled me into the Star Wars universe, specifically the Edge of the Empire RPG from Fantasy Flight Games. So I've talked about how I got back into D&D and how I pulled Jason in. But Jason, how did you end up? I mean, obviously I know some of the story, but Star Wars wise, how did that end up being your entry point?
Yeah, it's a good question. Hi, everybody. I gotta say, I'm excited on this one because, as Brad knows, I geek out most about role playing Star Wars. Um, Also, just a little correction. Um, so that you all know, Brad has legitimate cred when it comes to the Star Wars universe. I honestly think you know more about it than I do. Certainly some of the old and extended canon, but you didn't quote unquote grow up playing Star Wars RPG. I know you and I talked about this, Brad, a bit in the first and or second episodes, so I'll keep it brief, but essentially our good friend Scott got me into Star Wars role playing, the West End Games D6 system when we were in high school. And then we continued to play intermittently, um man, almost until I was in grad school. Actually, I think into grad school. And so I didn't get a ton of games, but we played over a number of years. And I really fell in love with it. And what's interesting, maybe because I know Brad and I talk a lot about like one-on-one D&D games and whatnot. Most of my Star Wars RPG experience with Scott and with another of our mutual friends, Brian, whom we will eventually have on the show, because I'm sure he tried to ask me at least 3 times. And eventually it's going to happen unless he's listening, and then it won't. But regardless, we I played in, they would be either one on one or 1-on-2. So Scott would GM, absolutely brilliant GM, by the way. And then it would be me and Brian, or my brother might be there. So they were always really small tables. But that's how I got started. And total transparency, up until, let's see, it's 21 now. It was 2017 when I decided, to hell with it. I don't care what people think. I'm a big boy and I'm going to get back into RPGs. Um, I Up until that point, I honestly had never played anything else RPG wise, and and didn't even think of other games as RPGs until you, Brad, pulled me into Pathfinder and now D&D. But of course, those are stories and explorations that will be coming over the next months.
As of yet, so when it comes to what we'll call D6 Star Wars for the episode, I only had the privilege of being part of it, literally half of an episode or half of a game that our friend Scott was GMing. I've seen him GM other times, and I've been a spectator, and he's one of the best I've ever heard. But the one thing about D6 is you and I had moved away from RPGs because we had a lot of family and work and education. I always liked kind of the crunchiness. There's a little bit of that, more of the traditional RPG feel to the D6 Star Wars versus what we have now with the new Star Wars role playing system, Edge of the Empire, Force and Destiny, and Age of Rebellion. So I know you really got into, and the crux obviously was because Edge of the Empire came out first. That's what got you into it. For me, we'll talk about that in a bit. I had a struggle with it at first because it is not a crunchy system, and I work with a lot of data and numbers, so it's very. I had trouble adapting. Now, based off of what you do and your experiences and all that, did you have that same type of or did you want to head in that direction, or how did that fit with you, mentally or within your life ecosystem, for lack of a better term?
Yeah. In brief, yes, no, and good question. Or wait, no, yes, and good question. I already lost it. Yes. It's a really good question. So for those of you who aren't overly familiar with Fantasy Flight Games, narrative dice system, it's very different. And I mean, Brad brings up a really good question, I think, not just for the two of us, but for a lot of players or potential players. um Brad's an analyst, I'm a scientist. We have been talking about like very conceptual, non-scientific, non-analytic things since our college days. But at the end of the day, we still want some evidence, right? We still want to really vet these ideas. Well, with the narrative system, it's totally different. So did I have a struggle adapting? I did, um when I was first introduced through reading about this. But you know what, Brad, that changed my mind was a couple things. At least one, Jay Little, the developer of this system. Actually, if those in the audience know anything about current day RPGs, Jay Little has had his hands on all kinds of the major games. I mean, hats off. Um, but but I had watched or maybe read a few interviews with him, and I thought, okay, clearly this guy isn't dinking around. He's really putting a lot of thought into this. And then as I explored the narrative dice system, it became clear, okay, this is a different animal, but it's actually very, very data driven and analytic. If you don't believe me, listeners, just Google the narrative dice system and add like table of probabilities, and you can see how all of the all of the math is under the hood in this system. It's just not out in front of you.
Do you think that today, it's a different it's obviously our generation plays, the generation even before us has players. All you have to do is go out onto Twitch or YouTube and you can watch live play, and it's multi-generational. Curious as to your thought, because obviously you and I come from a very roll the dice analytical type of era. How does the narrative, do you think, the introduction of the system, because this is, I'll let you elaborate, it's very unique. How does that play into potentially the generational differences that we are now in today? There's, in effect, you know, Jason and I were Gen X. We have millennials, and now we have for people our age, our kids are Gen Z. So
Yep.
how does this game differ from when we were their age playing a D6 versus now them playing if that makes any sense, a narrative system?
It's a really neat idea. It's a really great question. You and I were talking about this offline before we began recording. um I don't know if I have any great insight, but I wonder, like, you think back to Gygax and Arneson and the genesis, no pun intended, of D&D, like early days. And that was a desire, first and foremost, to perhaps feel like, you as a player were part of the world that you had on the uber nerdy table in front of you with all of your little people and horses and all this stuff, right? You had all of these miniatures, but it was super removed, super abstract, typically based on history. And then with the creation of D&D, it was a big step away from that, but it was still very much about combat roles and whatnot. Okay, well, it was also what was that? It was right around time we were born, so we're talking like early 70s, right? Okay,
Yeah, yeah, late 60s, early 70s.
yeah, right. So a little before our time, certainly before it caught on. And now let's think for a moment, everybody, about what were the canons available, right? Like Star Trek had its 3-year run, and that was groundbreaking. And you had things like Doctor Who, and of course Lord of the Rings had been around already for how long, how many decades, and the world would never be the same. Star Wars didn't yet exist at all. Marvel existed, but right, barely, and only in comic form. And you want to get a good laugh, I did this with my father yesterday. You want to get a good laugh, go to Wikipedia and look up the original characters. And it's like, the flaming what? Right? Things have changed, right? Why is this guy on fire and why is she invisible? Um, and and now in 2021, we have such immersive multimedia canons where we can stream TV, we can watch movies. We have, I mean, my one of my Gen Z's, right? My younger of two daughters, she is addicted to Instagram feeds of WandaVision, because as we record this, we just saw the penultimate episode of season 1. Okay, so I think, in try to abbreviate this already too long answer to your question, Brad, I think part of it is you couldn't have had a narrative dice system 20 years ago, certainly not 30 years ago, because you couldn't have had the canon, and you can now. And here's what I mean by that. So and I want Brad's input on this, because we're approaching it. I've spent more time GMing this system. You've spent a little more time playing it. And of course, we, like with D&D, I've never GM'd. It's all play, you GM. But the narrative dice system, and don't worry, we're going to get into the mechanics, because they're really wonky in a positive way. But the narrative dice system, I think, puts an added onus on the GM, because it's saying, look, we want the crunchiness of the other systems, but it's under the hood. So the players don't necessarily see it unless they want to, but the GM has to see it. And at the same time, because it's narrative, the probability spaces around these roles, which are so wonderfully rich, end up falling on the really adept GM, or me. But they fall on the GM, who then on the fly has to come up with really nuanced win and lose scenarios. And I just don't think you see that in other systems.
No, and I asked a loaded question because I think even differently. Maybe I'm going to say the same thing, or I'm going to slant it. But when we were playing D6 Star Wars, especially more when you were playing it, that was an era that mechanic really was kind of in some form or another. The mechanics were all kind of similar. It was, I don't want to say binary, but it was a very straightforward mechanic. The narrative system, if you think about it, think back, and this is obviously opinion. think back to the 80s, even into the early to mid 90s. I don't think, and I'd have to go back. I'm no expert. Maybe those of you listening can comment on this. I don't think we've seen a really true narrative type of system like this before, or even attempted before. So this was very unique, and for me, that was problematic because as I've gotten older, I went into college where I met Jason. I went into college thinking I was going to be more artistic and less analytical. That's who I thought I was, and it wasn't who I was. I am actually more analytical. And Jason and I would, instead of doing foolish things that early 20 somethings would normally do,
like dating and having friends.
Yeah, exactly. We would sit around and talk about faith, economics, religion. I mean, this is the real onus for the real theme for this whole series. This is what we'd sit and talk about at night or during the day or whenever the case is, instead of actually socializing and learning how to interact with people, which makes it somehow, I don't know how lucky we are that we actually found people that would marry us. So
lucky.
Yeah. That being said, I've digressed. The D6 system didn't feel all that much different to me than when I would play Dungeons and Dragons, back when I would play the original Red Box and even a little bit of AD&D when they had regular and advanced. You were actually the one that drove us back into full RPGs. I've always collected books and read the books. I loved reading about the mechanics, even if I didn't play them. You started playing. You started picking up the material. You didn't pick up, I mean, when I mean by picking up the material, I didn't mean buy books. You were just immersing yourself into the material online and in effect in the source book. And you finally convinced me to play. In fact, when I pulled out my Edge of the Empire book tonight to have it near me, I mentioned offline that I still have my character in the book. And I remember going back to that first time playing where it was our friend Brian, myself, Jason, you were GMing, and without boring people, it was really kind of a droid-based episode where we were interacting with them, and there were some much greater themes to it. I struggled. I still remember to this. I still remember very distinctly sitting down here in our rec room area. I'd have to ask you what to roll and how to roll it, because for me, I couldn't grasp it. It was such a stretch for me, and I'm not used to that. So I find it interesting that knowing how much we've stated we get out of analytical, but when we start talking, it always tends to fall into some sort of analytic for the most part. This game is so off that. As a player, for me, it took a while. But the benefit of it, and this is where we get into the theme of it, it changed my mindset in terms of how my decision making in the narrative system almost is more reflective of real life to me than a D6 or binary type of system.
Yeah, you guys can't see me nodding vigorously, but I think that's exactly right. I totally agree with Brad. What attracts me to this system is that it is so easy to apply to real life and vice versa. So should we talk about that? Should we get into it?
Yeah, let's do that. I've been dancing around that. Let's go right in.
No, let's jump in. So let's set up the context for the mechanic. So I think what you said, Brad, in terms of the steep learning curve of the dice system, I think that's realistic. It's actually not that difficult, in my opinion. I recall having a much harder time being thrown into the D6 system, right? What the hell is a pip? But of course, now I use that term when I'm playing Edge of the Empire. But I had a harder time getting into the D6 mechanic than the narrative system of Edge of the Empire, because once I thought I got what the narrative system was about, it was like, oh, this actually makes sense. But that said, if you listen to pretty much any of the actual play podcasts that use this system, over and over and over, and these are people who play a ton of RPGs. Over and over and over, you hear, okay, so I'm not sure what I'm supposed to roll. Right. Even now, I still look stuff up constantly. Okay, so let's set up the context then. Yes, there's a bit of a learning curve. No, it's not insurmountable. And once you get into it, like once you actually see the roles in your tray, boom, it just starts to make sense, like you said, because it's so nuanced. It's like, this is real world stuff. Like, I had this kind of crap happen to me the other day. Um, and that's what I love about this game. Okay, so context. Let's start big picture. Star Wars. Now, I am admittedly, as Brad knows, a dyed-in-the-wool Trekkie. That in no way diminishes my love for Star Wars, but I'm always going to end up on the Enterprise if I have my choice. That said, I think one of the reasons Star Wars has worked so well writ large as a canon of entertainment, of thought, even of philosophy, is because it's so realistic. It's so gritty, right? There's no J.J. Abrams flair. Okay, last movies, there is a little bit of flair, a little bit of lens glare. But aside from that, it's gritty. Like when you are watching anything Star Wars, and I think The Mandalorian epitomizes this more than any of the others, even, it's like you're in a real world, right? Everything looks used. So we are given this visual headcanon where it's like, well, most of us can imagine walking around in that world, and it looks like a real world, but with droids and beeping and buzzing things. Okay. And then we take these dice, and so there's this whole patina of dice. And here's how we're going to do this. We're going to keep it nice and simple. Essentially, there are good dice and there are bad dice. Really, there are positive dice and negative dice numerically. There's a twist, and Brad and I are going to get into that in a moment. But first, let's set this up. There are 7 distinct dice in this system. That's, I think, what scares some people. But once you realize it's just good dice and bad dice, it starts to click. And I mean, I say this because I think you've done this with at least one of your kids, right? Tried it, Brad?
We tried a little bit, but
Yeah.
not to the extent that you have. But it was partially because I think you've, and then we'll get back to it. Like you said, there are 7 dice,
Yeah.
and there's positives and negatives, and then there's little nuances to it.
Yeah.
They caught onto it better than I did,
You're
and
right.
that's a generational thing. And if anyone wonders whether we script this or if this is more organic,
Well, I think they pretty much know we don't
yeah,
script.
this I hopefully you've figured out by now that this is organic because I'm on mute and I'm scribbling things and Jason's scribbling things as we're talking.
Yeah, we do this so that it's a legit conversation like the many we have. Yeah, so like Brad has tried this at least with your son once. I GM'd maybe half a dozen times for my daughters. I continue to do it infrequently. I really need to up it for their sake with my brother's sons, with my nephews and niece a little bit, but especially the nephews. And right, they all a couple, half an hour in, they all start to get it. Okay, so there are 7 dice. Now, they are all narrative dice. This is what's confusing. There are no numbers on the dice, but they still have very distinct probabilities. Now, as an aside, you actually do need an 8th die. You need to have a D100. I have 2 different D10s. It only comes into play when you have the great good fortune to roll a crit on a combat roll. And then the D100 identifies what critical damage you instill on your victim. Sorry, I mean your opponent. I don't know why they have to use a D100. It kind of takes the mojo out of the process because there's not really anything narrative about it, but so be it. That's a little confusing for players the first time, but let's face it, if you play like I do, you almost never get a crit, so it's a non-issue. Now, we've got, Brad's laughing, but it's sadly true. So we've got 3 good dice and 3 bad dice. So I'm gonna walk us through this briefly, because you can always look this up. It really helps if you do it visually. And Brad, you just interrupt along the way because I might be taking things for granted. Okay, the basic dice in the system are the ability and difficulty dice. And they all have different colors, by the way. Honestly, most people in my experience just call it the green dice and the purple dice. Green good, purple bad. The ability dice you roll based on your stats as a PC. The difficulty dice you roll based on the GM assigned difficulty level of the task at hand. I know that sounds confusing. It turns out to be a really elegant way to roll. And in fact, what excites me about this is real world is applying the difficulty level of 0 dice being 0 purples being simple, effortless, to 5 being formidable, almost impossible. It's like, welcome to my life.
Well, and if like I said, I struggled with it until we started working through it. And to your exact point, what you just explained shows the crunchy analytical component to this that sits behind the curtain. And as a player, until I could see it from Jason's perspective as the game master, after the game, we in effect did almost like a mini walkthrough, whereas I would make decisions and we would roll, he would walk me through it. It is very. I don't think it does it justice by saying it's a not crunchy system, and I think I was very myopic in somewhat not ignoring it, not belittling it, but just keeping it at a distance because I preferred something a little deeper. And as we'll come to find out as we talk in future games, it turned out that I preferred this type of game system, this more open environment versus what we had played prior, which is why I think D&D 5, which is what we talked about, and now with Edge of the Empire, they've resonated.
Yeah, big time. Big time. So now let's add to that crunchiness. Still no numbers, but the GM needs to know what's going on with it. If you have as a PC pips or skill ranks, you can replace green ability dice with yellow proficiency dice. And what happens is you're going from a D8 to a D12, and the probability tuning is a little different. So, and just bear with me on this, listeners. Brad and I are going to explain this because we haven't actually gone to the wonky part yet. The proficiency dice make you more likely to be successful than the ability dice, but with negative quirks, with weird stuff that happens. The mirror image of that is that the GM can upgrade a purple difficulty die to a red challenge die, and that's pretty rare, but there might be reasons, like maybe you're in combat against a really formidable foe who's an NPC. Okay, but fundamentally they work the same. So green and yellow good, purple red bad. And then one of the things that's so simple and quirky, but I love it about the system, is you then have the blue boost and the black setback dice. The boost dice are added, or really one or more boost dice are added anytime the GM says or rules that anything in your situation, environment, anything could possibly be an advantage to the system, to the role, to the situation. And the flip of that, if there's anything problematic about the environment, they can say, add a setback die. So for example, maybe you ate your Wheaties that morning. As a PC, you get a blue boost die in your morning roll. Maybe you are slogging through difficult terrain to get to a treasure chest, though I guess that would be of kyber crystals because it's Star Wars. And the GM says, okay, add a setback die. It's so nuanced and so real life. I can't tell you how many times in the past few years something in especially at work, has happened. And it's like, you know what? I'm obviously rolling a blue one for this one. Or man, someone just tossed in a setback die for me.
If all of you listening who haven't played haven't heard it already, what you just explained, it reminded me of the fact that this system has married, I'm not going to say this right, has married fluidity and analytics in a way that, in effect, to your exact point, almost mimics real life. For me, having to build, a presentation for a peer and go through data, or for me, I manage directly or indirectly about 25 people. How I interact with each one of them, you know, there is a probability to their response based off of my action, but there's also a fluidity to it. If I think that's right. So this is a system that I think almost is responsive to our world and society now more than any others before. It's created, like Jason said, we're talking about a lot of dice here, but it's not as difficult as one is led to believe if you take your time and look at it. Actually, watch it get played. The question I have for you, and our children, Gen Z, many call it the TikTok generation, where it's short video, short blips. Both of us have interactions in some form or another in the educational world, and we all know, whether you're a student or wherever you're involved, that generations after us learn differently than we did. Do you think the narrative dice system reflects attention span, or the need for, or what a millennial or a Gen Zer is more comfortable starting out with as a game versus a Pathfinder or whatnot, or a more crunchy system? Did I ask that correctly? I think I'm
Yeah,
trying
no,
to.
I think no, I think that was a really no, I think you answered, yeah, because we've talked
But
about this, yeah.
yeah, and I don't want to get away from the mechanic. It's just the point of it is the mechanic is so different. Is the mechanic a response to a generational shift, or is the mechanic, was it an independent decision, and was it a good fit or not?
I have two thoughts. Um, my first thought is I fundamentally disagree with everything you just said. From a
And that's why, folks, you could tell it's an organic
That's right,
conversation.
right. Fundamentally, from a cognitive science point of view, um, the and this is a whole other discussion. And so we won't belabor it here for all of you listeners. Just like learning styles is a myth. We know that through research. How we learn, how we're able to learn, that hasn't changed. But here's what I do think. In the and Brad, you know this stuff way better than I do, so indulge me. In the 50s into the 60s, we were still running businesses through theory X management. And so there was the expectation that everything was very top down, regimental, not a lot of questioning, very, shall we say, D20-ish. But not in a good way.
No, no, that is the IBM Big Blue
Yeah.
School of Management. You got it.
Now, I think many societies, certainly American society, expects, allows, even indulges the notion that there can be many different ways to run a business, to interact with material, to be intrinsically motivated, to choose what you want to learn, when, where. And so you look at leadership back in the 50s, 60s, very theory X. prior to, kind of the humanistic revolution. Now in 2021, we're still kind of coming off in leadership from our transformational leadership high. Well, if we look at the dice system, basically to me, it's, the old school D20, not the 5e, which we both love, but the original D20 system was very limited in terms of available options for players. That and so was management options. So was the option of challenging authority. Today, if we're not encouraged to challenge authority, we should be. And there are so many opportunities, so many options for leading, for learning, for moving ahead in life. And that's what we also see in the narrative system. So I don't personally think, well, it's not personal. Based on the research, I don't think it has anything to do with a cognitive shift. I think it's probably more endemic to this is where we are as a society, that there are more options for more people on the table and how they want to run their lives and be than there ever have been before. And there are mechanics now in the systems that better reflect that.
The fact that you heard that Jason disagrees with me, we now have that on audio record. But like I said, we talk all the time, but that is hardly the 400,000th time in 30 years that hasn't happened. Okay, that being said, push versus pull. So my thought from a mechanics perspective.
Wait, may I interrupt you for a sec? Because we have one more die.
Oh yeah, go.
Yes. This is the challenge of the system. Okay, so we have our good ability and proficiency dice. And then our boost die. We have our bad difficulty challenge and setback dice. And then there is, for me, the wonkiest, the hardest to use, the force die. I'm really inexpert with this. Just ask my nephews. I think I understand the rudiments of it. It's beyond the scope of our discussion here today for all of you. Needless to say, it's a neat system. It works differently. It's not really a narrative dice. It's not really a narrative die compared to the others, but it's there. It only applies if you happen to have a force sensitive character. So this is a much bigger deal in the Force and Destiny port than it is of the Edge of the Empire or the Age of Rebellion. Now, that said, before we go over...
Just real quick, does Edge of the Empire offer or talk about force sensitivity or not, or was that not introduced?
Yeah, it does. It's good. There's a very little chapter in the core rule book. You can absolutely have it. You can play anything from all three of the core rule books across any game in any of those three core rule books. It's one unified system. It's just much less likely. So there's one more wonky piece to add to this, but I'm going to turn it back to Brad because I think with your thoughts, we're going to get into it because we haven't even gotten to the whole success and challenge thing.
Well, I go to the diet because if I don't, like I said, this is organic. If we don't get to my question this time, we'll get to it next time. But, I think I don't want people to be afraid when they hear wonky because it's wonky, but it is fun.
Lots of fun.
It is just a fun mechanic, and we've only scratched the surface in 3 episodes of the depths of which we can go into these mechanics in real life. But I just have found the like I said before, the analytics and the free flowing of it. It's so unique, and it is unique from. I'll talk about the die, and then we'll jump over quick before we have to wrap up. But the decision making and the push-pull between the game master and the players, how it's different between D20 and narrative.
And I think, thanks for the setup. I think actually this is the point that we would definitely, actually we both agree on almost all of this stuff, but I think what pulls both of us into this system, it's not all of the dice, which are really fun. It makes for really interesting, complex trays, but just checks. But what makes it interesting is in the system, there are the same symbols across all of the dice. And in a nutshell, we're going to oversimplify here. There are specific options that come out of this, and they're weighted. Yes, you can be successful, you can have a success, or you can have a failure. However, that's rare. In the Star Wars FFG narrative dice system, whenever you have a success on a rolled check, you typically also have what's known as threat. Whenever you have a failure, you typically have what's known as advantage. And those threats and advantages, that's the narrative element. So it's basically, it's real life, isn't it? Some days you get the bear, some days the bear gets you. But it's kind of like a Coen Brothers movie, honestly. No matter how good things are, something still hits the fan along the way. No matter how bad things are, there's still something positive that pops up along the way. And as the GM, so to turn it back to your question where you want to go, as the GM, uh, the player rolls, and based on their success or failure outcome, they either succeed or fail at the check. But as the GM, then you have to work with them in the moment to narrate, well, what does this advantage mean? And what does this threat mean? And typically they don't mean anything mechanically, it's flavor. But if there's enough advantage or threat, it becomes mechanical. And I'm sorry, people, but that's life. That's
Yeah.
real life.
I think between us talking about D&D 5e and Star Wars, it's Edge of the Empire, different systems. One could argue one is over better than the other. I think I would argue that that is absolutely not the case, and that it's just two different flavors of reality. Um, you know, as someone who is a very, very, very novice level GM, I have my what Jason and other players know as the infamous GM's prerogative, where you'd see, if you saw his face, that gives us that type of ability. The game allows for it. Edge of the Empire, the narrative system, and for those that know or don't know, FFG came out with Genesis, which is in effect a system that you could adapt to other. It's based off of narrative. You could adapt it to any world you want to create. It's it, you're never purely successful and you're never purely failure. There's something like you just said. You know, I may have as someone who is. We both do music as a side. We play through a piece. We have success playing as a whole, but there are areas. Jason studies, I study, we study with people or have. There will always be something that has been a problem that needs to be worked on. And it may be the same thing last week as it was this week. It may be something different. I think that's the biggest difference is I think for you, and maybe I'm wrong, I think at times GMing an Edge of the Empire game can almost be a little bit more complicated than GMing a D&D game for us as novices, because there's just the nuance is different. I don't even know how to explain it without it making it sound like one is better than the other, which it's not.
It's not. They're different and they're both wonderful. I think we would agree, Brad, that I think, I mean, limited experience here, but I think whereas the D&D 5e mechanic is remarkably elegant in large part because of its efficiency, the FFG narrative dice mechanic for Star Wars is equally elegant, but because of its ability to tell stories through the mechanic. And, we're lucky that we get to have it both ways.
Yeah, and I know we've talked about, adapting the narrative dice mechanic to a number of different sci-fi universes or ecosystems in the future. You know, I think we'll always continue to play D&D. I think we get great joy out of it. We'll continue. We've kind of paused it because we've been doing D&D, but we're going to get back to Edge of the Empire. But you know what we've been talking about, we've just been scratching the surface. You know, we're only in episode 3, and we've really hit on two very unique systems that complement each other in many ways, that give you the same result. And over the next 3 episodes, in effect, what we're going to do is set ourselves up with a couple of the major systems out there, do the introductions like we have been through these 3 episodes, and then Jason and I, we could have almost skipped recording tonight because we were so busy planning out, and it was organic at the moment. We were talking about how, you know, talking about the economics amongst these systems and how it compares to, you know, what we're encountering. The faith. I'm not going to even use the R word, religion. I'm just going to say faith as a broad-based topic between these systems, between these universes. So, you know, there's, you know, as you continue to listen, you're going to see this. You're going to see us drill deeper and deeper and deeper into this. We've only just scratched the surface, because I'm just scribbling, because just you talking about threat advantage and with success and failure, you know, that could be that to me. I want to have a big conversation about that, and that's just not going to be today, but it's going to come. So, that being said, I am looking at the imaginary clock. I have no idea how long to run, but just these days, as we start to prepare, and you know, it's Brad's fault that we haven't recorded sooner because things have been very busy. But now that we're back on a normal schedule, we're planning out. So, Jace, what have you been, amongst everything else going on in our lives, with, you know, being a new normal? What have you been looking at in the world of sci-fi, you know, media universes, RPGs or whatnot? And what do you think? What's been hitting a nerve with you lately?
Yeah, you hit a nerve. Oh wait, that was the wrong question. Okay, so since we've already walked over the GM corner, boy, uh, you know, I think you've been doing this too. Like, well, I guess like the rest of the world, probably, at least if you are streaming Disney Plus these days, like the rest of the world. Um, my daughters are quite enamored with WandaVision. And so that's been the bulk of what I've been watching. But you know, the truth is, I have devoted so much cognitive time the past month or two to Star Trek that it's at an all-time high, even for me, at least going back to my early mid-teens when TNG was new. And it's because, and I won't say much here, it's the wrong venue perhaps, but I finally found a way to, at least for a while, integrate my scholarship with my love of Trek. So I'm involved in projects where I'm working on this stuff daily, and I have to talk about Star Trek. So I've been thinking a lot about that, but and I'll wrap up with this. I still have not found any of the Star Trek RPGs to be overly provocative. And don't worry, listeners, because we're going to get into Star Trek Adventures before long, and we're going to have a good time with that. But I find myself honestly spending a lot of time looking forward to what is it, Candlekeep, whatever the new book is coming out from Wizards of the Coast. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to you. What have you been playing with?
It's funny you mentioned, because as the D&D dungeon master, I am getting notifications of new books by you. You're catching it before I am. On the flip side, like Jason said, we're yeah, exactly. You know, Jason and I could talk days and end up with divorces getting too deep into Trek. But as Jason said, he's at an all-time Trek high. I'm the one that's been big into reading the Modiphius series Star Trek Adventures, which is why we're going to get into it. And I'm looking over here and I can see I have the new Klingon source book. I just got notification for those of you who are listening to it. We're almost March of 2021. I just got notice of shipment of the new Game Master screen and everything. So I've been catching up on the Trek game. I have been focusing more time on building the world that we have been playing D&D in, and I am way overdue in sitting Jason down and sending him back into that world. But, and I'll leave it at this, and this might be good for a comment if anyone ever wants to comment on this. Marvel created the cinematic universe. You talked about it with WandaVision. It's TV shows, it's on-demand TV and movies in the theaters. Disney is starting to do that now with Star Wars. Paramount is starting to do it with Star Trek. You have a Star Trek RPG that we're going to talk about. We've already talked about D6 Star Wars and FFG Star Wars. We haven't even talked about what went on between that. When are we going to see a Marvel-based RPG that hits more mainstream, like a Star Trek or a Star Wars type of thing? And could you adapt it, or have people adapted it using either the Genesis narrative system that Star Wars uses, or Fate, or something else? And that has, Jason, I haven't even mentioned this to him, so this is the first time he's heard it. I've been fascinated. The Marvel Cinematic Universe to me is we'll get into it another time. I love it. I'm waiting to see a real impactful RPG.
I think, and I think this is exactly why we need to keep our eyes on what is going to happen with Edge Studios. Why every week I look to see if there's any news out there other than the occasional drop of a drawing, because they seem to have many, if not all, of the IP for tabletop as FFG does for miniatures and card games. And FFG is running with their Marvel card stuff. So maybe you'll get your wish before long.
Yeah, and we'll have to see. I mean, right now, we're going to be talking about, I think we're talking about, in effect, 5 central systems over the next few weeks, and then we're going to dive in. I don't know where I'd be able to fit in another system, but I'm more fascinated when we talk about mechanic is the systems that we do play. Other major brands, where would they fit best? Could you adapt a D&D type 5e mechanic into the Marvel Universe? Can you adapt a Genesis Star Wars mechanic, or is there something we don't even know about yet? Is it being worked on? That's been on my mind a lot, just because honestly, folks, with it being winter and Jason and I are both in the north, no one's out doing a lot
Having
outside.
fever.
Yeah, and so there's been a lot of Disney Plus streaming in this house as well, not just WandaVision, but getting ready for Winter Soldier, Falcon and the Winter Soldier, and the Winter Soldier, and then Loki. So for me, as much as Jason's been on a Star Trek high, I'm waiting for these episodes to come out. I'm waiting for these series to come out.
All right, everybody. That's going to wrap it up for us on our 3rd episode. Thanks so much for joining us for all or parts of these. Moving forward, since we dropped these 3 together, moving forward, you can expect a new episode to drop a month from now, and every month after that. If things really pick up, or Brad retires decades early, maybe we'll do this more often, but I don't know how we'll be able to manage that. But we will be dropping an episode monthly coming out, and we have lots planned. So thanks as always. Stay safe, mask up, be well. We'll see you next month.
Take care, folks. Stay safe.